The year is 1943, and the skies over the Reich are darkening, but not with the swift, graceful silhouettes of the aircraft the German pilots respected, like the P-51 Mustang or the nimble Spitfire. No, this new threat lumbering into view was something the Luftwaffe pilots initially dismissed with open mockery: the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. They gave it derogatory nicknames: the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or perhaps just a reference to its massive, bottle-shaped fuselage, and truly believed that this overweight, brute-force fighter was simply too much machine, too cumbersome, and too reliant on its monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine to ever truly excel in low-level combat. Their initial assessment wasn't entirely baseless. The P-47 was, by the standards of the time, obscenely heavy, tipping the scales at over 10,000 pounds empty, nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Its genesis was as a high-altitude escort fighter, designed specifically to carry its pilot and that huge engine, plus a complex pressurized cockpit and the revolutionary turbo supercharger system hidden deep within the belly of the machine, all the way to 30,000 feet to protect the B-17 Flying Fortress fleets. German generals, comfortable in their belief that the air war was primarily a struggle for high-altitude supremacy, focused their resources on improving their interceptors, confident that the bulky American fighter lacked the maneuverability and range for anything more than escort duty. This deep-seated strategic error, rooted in the P-47's initial design brief, would eventually cost them the war on the Western Front, tank by tank, truck by truck, and life by agonizing life. They saw the sheer size of the airframe, the complexity of the supercharger ducts, and the radial engine's immense frontal area, and they laughed. What they failed to grasp was that this bulk wasn't a weakness, it was an asset. It meant armor plating surrounding the pilot like a steel shell. It meant sheer structural resilience that allowed the Thunderbolt to shrug off hits that would vaporize a lighter aircraft. And, most critically, that massive engine, a 2,000 horsepower behemoth, soon upgraded to nearly 2,800 horsepower in later variants, meant that while the Jug might be slow to accelerate, it could dive like a runaway freight train, carrying immense kinetic energy and a truly terrifying payload capacity. This capacity, ignored by German high command, was the true sleeper threat. The P-47, the supposed high-altitude truck, was about to trade the rarefied air of the stratosphere for the mud and blood of the hedgerows, transforming from an escort fighter into the undisputed master of ground obliteration. The transition was born out of necessity following D-Day, when the ground troops desperately needed an aerial hammer to smash the German counterattacks. Conventional dive bombing with 500-pound general-purpose bombs was often inaccurate against moving tanks, and the standard 8.5 caliber machine guns, while phenomenal against soft targets, struggled to consistently penetrate the thick frontal armor of the fearsome Panther and Tiger tanks that were the backbone of the Wehrmacht's remaining mobile forces. The Germans felt relatively safe on the ground, sheltered by the density of their armor and the narrow, winding roads of the French countryside, believing that the American airmen were too high, too fast, or simply too poorly armed to deal a decisive blow. This complacency was a death sentence waiting for its trigger, and that trigger was already being mounted beneath the P-47's sturdy wings, ready to deliver a shock that would literally shatter the confidence of the German officer corps. The shift in operational focus for the P-47 following the June 1944 invasion was not immediate, but evolutionary, driven by the brutal realities of the hedgerow fighting in Normandy. General Omar Bradley's ground forces were bogged down, suffering high casualties in the claustrophobic terrain. The German panzer divisions, though struggling with logistics, were utilizing the narrow fields and dense cover brilliantly, staging ambushes and executing localized counterattacks that bled the Allied momentum dry. The standard ordnance carried by the P-47 squadrons, the traditional bomb, and the ubiquitous 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns was simply insufficient to reliably neutralize the heavily armored German main battle tanks, especially the dreaded Tiger I and the equally formidable Panther. The machine guns could strafe infantry and soft-skinned vehicles into confetti, and they were brilliant for suppressing anti-aircraft fire. But against 100 millimeters of hardened, sloped steel on a Panther's front glacis plate, they were frustratingly ineffective, often just chipping paint or scarring the armor without a catastrophic result. Pilots were returning to base with stories of multiple passes on single tanks, only to see the tank commander stubbornly close the hatch and continue firing. This psychological warfare was wearing on the Allied troops, who knew that even with air superiority, neutralizing the core German fighting element, the armored divisions, required a new, decisive weapon. The challenge facing the ordnance engineers and the tactical Air Force commanders was twofold: finding a weapon that could penetrate heavy armor from the air, and ensuring the P-47, already a heavy beast, could carry enough of them to make a difference. Early attempts involved slightly modified general-purpose bombs, often dropped in a shallow dive, but the accuracy required was phenomenal, and the pilots risked flying directly into a concentrated hail of flak. The 9th Air Force needed a weapon that was easier to aim, delivered tremendous kinetic energy, and critically, employed a shaped charge warhead or simply enough brute force to crack open the heavy German armor like a walnut. This technical demand was complicated by the P-47's radial engine. Unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines of the P-51, the massive R-2800 needed massive airflow, making any wing-mounted ordnance that obstructed the airflow a significant performance killer. Yet the pressure from the front lines was immense. The infantry needed that air support, and they needed it to kill tanks, not just scare them. The P-47 pilots, true to the rugged spirit of their machine, started experimenting, flying incredibly low, sometimes just skimming the treetops, dodging power lines to increase their accuracy. They learned that the most vulnerable parts of the German tanks were not the front, but the thinner deck armor on top and the engine compartment in the rear. This required daring, dangerous passes directly over the target, increasing the risks tenfold, but it also started to yield results. A direct hit with a 500-pound bomb on the engine deck could indeed immobilize a Tiger, but such hits were rare. The stage was set for the introduction of a weapon that bypassed the complex physics of trajectory and aiming in a high-speed dive, and instead utilized pure guided rocket power, a weapon designed explicitly to punch holes through anything steel. The shift was coming, and it would redefine the very nature of close air support for the rest of the war. The German command, particularly Field Marshal Günther von Kluge and later Model, knew they had lost air superiority, but they comforted themselves with the belief that air interdiction was manageable. They saw the Allied air forces as primarily a strategic bombing threat against industry or a tactical threat against logistics, bridges, or rail lines. They believed that their armor, when dug in or rapidly maneuvering, remained the decisive element on the battlefield. This hubris stemmed from the belief that tanks moved too fast, were too small a target, and were too well armored for sustained effective air attack by conventional means. This arrogant assumption was shattered by the arrival of the weapon that the pilots called the Holy Moses, officially designated the High-Velocity Aircraft Rocket, or HVAR. This was not a weapon conceived on the spur of the moment. It was the culmination of years of rocketry research, significantly improving upon earlier, less powerful rocket designs like the British RP-3. The HVAR was a 5-inch diameter rocket, nearly 6 feet long, weighing 140 pounds fully loaded, and capable of being fitted with various warheads, including high-explosive and anti-armor armor-piercing heads. When the P-47 pilots first saw these massive tubes being attached to their underwing pylons, up to 10 rockets per aircraft in later configurations, they understood immediately that the Jug was transforming from a fighter bomber into a dedicated armored column destroyer. The sheer speed of the HVAR, which could reach terminal velocities approaching 1,300 feet per second, gave it unprecedented flatness of trajectory compared to earlier rockets, making aiming substantially easier. Crucially, the 5-inch rocket had enough mass and velocity to deliver a devastating impact. When armed with an armor-piercing warhead, the HVAR didn't need to pierce the tank's thickest front plate. The impact, especially on the thinner side or top armor, created massive spalling inside the tank, effectively knocking out the crew and the machinery through shock and fragmentation. The tactical deployment of the HVAR changed everything about the P-47's mission profile. No longer did the pilot need to struggle with the inherent inaccuracy of a bomb dropped from altitude, nor did they have to rely on lucky hits with the .5 caliber rounds. Now they could approach the target, usually a column of panzers attempting a rapid movement or counterattack, in a shallow dive, launch the rockets in a paired ripple or even a full salvo, and then use the 8 machine guns to suppress the inevitable flak and the accompanying infantry. The sound of a P-47 launching a salvo of HVARs was unique and terrifying. A sudden, deafening shriek followed almost instantly by the crump of high explosives. This rocket attack doctrine was perfected by the pilots of the 9th Air Force's Tactical Air Command, turning the P-47 squadrons into highly specialized tank hunting units. The Germans had no viable countermeasure. Their flak guns, the dreaded 88mm and the lighter 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft cannons, were designed primarily to target aircraft flying at medium altitudes. The P-47s, utilizing the element of surprise and flying literally treetop level during their attack runs, often caught the German columns completely unawares. The combination of the sheer raw power of the HVARs and the invulnerability of the P-47, which could absorb incredible punishment and still fly home thanks to its sturdy construction and air-cooled engine, created a tactical imbalance that the Wehrmacht could never recover from after the breakout. The operational debut of the P-47 armed with HVARs was strategically timed to coincide with the most vulnerable phase of the German counteroffensive following the Allied breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra. General Patton's Third Army was surging across France, and the German response, the counterattack at Mortain, Operation Lutik, was intended to sever the Allied advance and push them back toward the sea. This desperate armored thrust, relying heavily on Panther and Tiger units, presented a concentrated target of exactly the type the P-47 pilots had been training for. The German plan was audacious, but it ignored one crucial element: the constant, terrifying presence of the Allied tactical air forces, now equipped with the ultimate tank-killing tool. As the German columns moved rapidly at dawn and dusk, attempting to mask their movements, they were intercepted by the cab rank system, a continuous rotation of P-47 squadrons circling the combat zone, waiting to be directed onto targets by forward air controllers. It was a conveyor belt of destruction. When a German armored column was spotted, the forward controller, often riding in a jeep close to the action, would radio in coordinates, and the waiting Thunderbolts would peel off in pairs or fours, transforming the peaceful French countryside into an arena of fire and metallic chaos. The reports flowing back to the German High Command were immediately alarming. They were losing tanks not individually, but in dozens, crippled and burning within minutes of being sighted. The HVARs, often launched just 500 yards from the target, provided an accuracy and destructive capability that surpassed anything the Germans had anticipated from the air. The sheer velocity of the rocket strike meant that a tank, even if not immediately penetrated, would often suffer catastrophic internal damage due to the intense pressure wave and localized explosion. The armor-piercing heads were particularly brutal, able to punch clear through the side armor of a Panther or the top deck of a Tiger. Imagine the scene. A column of armored fighting vehicles, engines roaring, attempting to move quickly through a narrow valley, only for the sky to suddenly fill with the shriek of diving P-47s. The pilots, flying so low that they could often see the panic on the faces of the tank commanders, would unleash their salvo. 10 rockets, weighing over half a ton of ordnance, slamming into the column in seconds. The lead tank explodes, blocking the road. The rear tank is hit, trapping the rest. The P-47s then circled back, their 8.50 caliber guns ripping apart the accompanying half-tracks and infantry who attempt to bail out. This wasn't merely attrition, it was annihilation. The speed of the destruction was what truly broke the German will. A squadron of P-47s could eliminate an entire platoon of tanks in a single coordinated pass. The psychological impact on the German ground troops was devastating. They learned that the roads were not safe, that the moment they tried to maneuver, the sky would open up. For the first time, the mobility that defined the German Blitzkrieg doctrine was completely negated by the power of close air support. The German generals, the architects of the Lightning War, were trained in an era where the tank was the supreme weapon on the battlefield, impervious to anything but anti-tank artillery or another tank. They had adapted to strategic bombing and fighter sweeps, but the notion that a single fighter aircraft, flying low and fast, could consistently and systematically neutralize their heaviest armor was an existential threat they simply hadn't factored into their strategic equations. When the full reports of the destruction at the Falaise Pocket began to filter back to Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from strategic planning to outright despair. The Falaise Gap became the defining moment of the P-47's dominance. Over a period of several horrific days in August 1944, the retreating remnants of 2 German armies, including several elite panzer divisions, were compressed into a narrow corridor, an area that Allied pilots quickly dubbed the killing ground. The P-47s, alongside their British counterparts, had an almost unimaginable target-rich environment. They flew literally hundreds of sorties per day. The rockets were expended wholesale. The machine gun ammunition was poured onto the fleeing vehicles until the barrels glowed red. The combination of the aerial assault and the concentrated Allied artillery fire turned the gap into a scene of unspeakable carnage, a massive, smoking graveyard of vehicles, horses, and men.
Crucially, it was the P-47s with their HVARs that delivered the killing blows to the armor that attempted to fight its way out or protect the retreat. The destruction was so complete that the roads were utterly impassable, choked with the wreckage of tanks whose heavy armor had been peeled back by rocket strikes. General Omar Bradley famously described the scene as one of the greatest killing grounds of the war. But the true measure of the P-47's success was the psychological reaction of the German High Command. Reports from German sources, captured interviews, and even some post-war testimonies confirmed the abject terror and frustration experienced by the commanders on the ground. One captured general staff officer reportedly broke down weeping when describing the massive aerial onslaught, unable to reconcile the massive industrial power and absolute air superiority of the Allies with the near impotence of his once proud armored formations. He spoke not of brave enemy pilots, but of inescapable, indiscriminate devastation delivered from a sky that had become an executioner. The generals realized they could no longer maneuver freely. Any concentration of motorized transport or armor necessary for defense or counterattack immediately became a magnet for the P-47s. This meant the entire German operational doctrine, which depended on rapid movement and localized superiority, was now invalid. They couldn't move reserves to reinforce a crumbling sector. They couldn't relocate supply dumps, and they couldn't even safely retreat without facing aerial liquidation. The P-47, initially mocked as the Jug, had single-handedly broken the backbone of the Wehrmacht's mobility. The plane itself proved virtually impervious to the light flak that was the only real defense the retreating columns could muster. Stories abound of Thunderbolts returning to base riddled with holes, stabilizer controls damaged, flaps shredded, yet the robust radial engine, which lacked the vulnerable coolant systems of its inline counterparts, kept running, bringing the pilot and his war machine home safely, ready to be patched up and fly the next mission of destruction. This resilience compounded the German despair. They couldn't shoot the damn things down reliably, and they couldn't stop them from annihilating their most valuable assets. The P-47 and its HVARs had become the weapon system that neutralized German armored supremacy, reducing the formidable Panther tanks to mere burning roadblocks.
The inherent structural robustness of the P-47 was arguably its true secret weapon alongside the HVARs, a factor that intensified the despair of the German field commanders. The German flak operators were highly skilled, particularly with the lethal 20mm and 37mm cannon systems, but the sheer abuse the Thunderbolt could absorb defied military logic. The design genius of Alexander Kartveli, the P-47's chief designer, centered around making the fighter practically bulletproof in the cockpit area and structurally redundant everywhere else. The pilot sat atop a massive armor plate, often referred to as the bathtub, and the air-cooled radial engine, unlike its liquid-cooled rivals, could sustain multiple hits to its cylinders without seizing up immediately. A punctured coolant line in a P-51 or a Bf-109 meant a rapid glide to a forced landing or a bailout. A damaged cylinder on an R-2800 often just meant slightly rougher running, allowing the pilot to escape the flak zone. German intelligence reports, analyzing captured P-47 wreckage, often expressed astonishment at the density of the metal, the overlapping protection layers, and the general over-engineering of the airframe, recognizing too late that the aircraft's bulk was not clumsiness, but armor. When a P-47 dove low to launch its HVARs, it became the focal point of all available anti-aircraft fire.
Yet time and again, Thunderbolts staggered back to Allied airfields looking like sieves, wings perforated, control surfaces mangled, pieces of fuselage missing, only for the pilot to step out unharmed. This level of survivability meant that the P-47 pilots, especially those in the famed 365th Fighter Group and the 405th Fighter Group, developed an aggressive, almost reckless confidence in their machine. They knew they could take the risk of flying into dense flak concentrations to ensure the deadly accuracy of their rocket attacks. This cycle of impunity and destruction further demoralized the German ground forces. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't stop, flying a plane they couldn't shoot down, deploying a weapon they couldn't defend against. The operational tempo of the P-47 squadrons became relentless. They mastered the art of low-level navigation, using terrain features and obscured valleys to pop up unexpectedly over German positions. Fuel consumption was prodigious, but with constant resupply from the rapidly advancing Allied lines, the Thunderbolts provided continuous, overlapping coverage. The German generals started referring to the Allied air superiority not as a challenge, but as a condition of permanent, unavoidable catastrophe. They understood that the P-47 was not just destroying their tanks, it was destroying their tactical coherence. A field commander who knew his supply columns would be vaporized before they reached the front could not commit to a sustained engagement. A tank commander who knew that his vehicle, the symbol of German military might, was now a sitting duck the moment he ventured out of the closest village, lost all initiative. The Thunderbolt, the great bulky American answer to air combat needs, had become the ultimate expression of industrial warfare. Tough enough to survive, powerful enough to obliterate, and produced in such overwhelming numbers that the Germans faced an endless parade of destruction, soaring just above the tree line. This combination of resilience and firepower fundamentally changed the geometry of the Western Front, ensuring that the ground forces never again had to face a major German armored counterattack without immediate, overwhelming air support.
The transformation of the P-47 into the dominant close air support platform necessitated a profound shift in pilot training and doctrine. Escort pilots, accustomed to engaging enemy fighters at medium to high altitudes, where the P-47 excelled in speed and dive recovery, had to become mud fighters overnight. This transition demanded a new set of skills: pinpoint low-altitude navigation, split-second target recognition, mastery of the complex trajectory of the HVAR rockets, and the chilling necessity of flying directly through a curtain of light flak fire. The men of the 9th Air Force rose to the challenge, developing revolutionary tactics that maximized the synergy between the rugged aircraft and its deadly payload. They perfected the rocket delivery sequence, a shallow dive approach to build speed and stability, adjusting the dive angle based on the range to the target, launching the rockets in quick succession, often aiming for the front and rear of a column simultaneously to ensure a complete blockade, and then pulling up violently while simultaneously unleashing the 850 caliber guns to suppress the remaining infantry and flak units. The pilots quickly learned that the psychological damage was almost as effective as the kinetic. The deafening roar of the massive R-2800 engine at full throttle, just meters above the ground, combined with the sudden, fiery impact of the rockets, induced immediate panic. The Germans knew that once the P-47s arrived, they were trapped, unable to move or hide effectively. This continuous aerial harassment meant German logistics completely collapsed. Tanks that survived the initial HVAR assault often ran out of fuel or ammunition because the supply trucks bringing these essentials were systematically blown apart by the machine guns of the P-47s.
The Air Force targeted not just the fighting vehicles, but the entire nervous system of the Wehrmacht: command vehicles, fuel bowsers, mobile repair shops, and infantry columns. Without fuel, tanks are immobile pillboxes. Without ammunition, they are useless steel monuments. Without communication, the army is a headless giant. The P-47 squadrons, executing the cab rank policy flawlessly, ensured this paralysis was total and sustained. The German generals, increasingly insulated from the front line by the collapse of their communications, received reports that painted a picture of utter helplessness. They were facing an enemy that had perfected the industrialization of close air support. The sheer number of sorties flown was staggering. During the height of the Normandy campaign and the subsequent breakout, it was not uncommon for a single P-47 to fly 3 or 4 combat missions a day, each loaded with enough firepower to wipe out a small armored detachment. This relentless day-in and day-out presence meant the Germans never had a moment's respite. They couldn't repair roads, they couldn't salvage crippled tanks, and they couldn't rest their troops without the constant fear of a thunderbolt appearing out of the sun or over a ridge, unleashing a torrent of fire. This state of constant dread was strategically decisive. It didn't just win battles, it accelerated the overall collapse of the Western Front, turning what the Germans hoped would be a fighting retreat into a disorderly rout. The P-47, the much-maligned Jug, had become the primary instrument of the Wehrmacht's physical and psychological destruction, demonstrating that air power, when correctly equipped and utilized, could unilaterally defeat massed armor.
The German High Command desperately searched for countermeasures, recognizing that the P-47's mastery of the low-level fight threatened the very existence of their mobile army. They tried everything, increasing the density of their flak screens, deploying specialized anti-aircraft trains, and even attempting to integrate Luftwaffe remnants into ground defense roles. None of it worked consistently against the HVAR-equipped Thunderbolts. The standard German flak doctrine relied on predictable flight paths and altitude profiles. The P-47s flew with aggressive unpredictability, using terrain masking and surprise to minimize exposure to heavy flak. When they did encounter it, the pilots employed evasive maneuvers immediately after the rocket launch, often flying directly into the ground fire for the fraction of a second needed to acquire the target, relying entirely on the ruggedness of the P-47 to get them through the short, lethal burst. The German efforts to counter the P-47 reached almost ridiculous levels of desperation. Attempts were made to camouflage entire armored columns using elaborate nets and dense forest cover. But the ever-present Allied reconnaissance aircraft, and then the P-47s themselves, usually spotted the telltale tracks or subtle breaches in camouflage. Moreover, the sheer noise of the R-2800 engine, a low, throbbing rumble that could be heard miles away, acted as its own warning system. For the German tankers, that rumble became the sound of impending doom, a sound that elicited a physical, visceral dread. Commanders realized that even a successful rocket attack that didn't penetrate the tank's armor could still immobilize it by damaging the tracks or wheels. And an immobilized tank in a forward area was a death sentence, soon to be targeted by artillery or another P-47 returning with another full load of rockets. The tactical freedom the P-47 pilots possessed stemmed not just from the HVAR's destructive power, but from the realization that they were effectively immune from fighter interception. The remnants of the Luftwaffe were stretched thin, defending the Reich from strategic bombers, and those fighters that did appear near the front were often too few and too inexperienced to challenge the combat-hardened P-47 pilots,
who were well versed in air-to-air combat thanks to their earlier escort duties. Thus, the P-47 was allowed to roam the front lines with impunity, shifting its entire attention to ground targets. The German generals, watching their finest divisions dissolve into wreckage and chaos, began to rely heavily on night moves and incredibly slow, masked movements, sacrificing the speed and initiative that were the historical hallmarks of the Wehrmacht. This forced slowness was exactly what the Allied strategy required. The P-47 had successfully slowed the German army to a crawl, rendering its highly mobile forces inert. Stories from the front lines highlighted the mental strain. Tank crews, after enduring repeated strafing runs and rocket attacks, would often abandon their perfectly operable vehicles just to escape the terrifying psychological pressure of the low-flying Thunderbolts. This loss of morale, driven by the inescapable aerial threat, accelerated the Wehrmacht's collapse far faster than purely material losses might suggest. This was the true secret weapon of the P-47, the ability to turn the German army's greatest strength, mobility, into its greatest vulnerability, and doing so with such terrifying efficiency that generals were left contemplating the complete destruction of their entire motorized fighting force.
The sustained effectiveness of the P-47 in the ground attack role forced the German High Command into a disastrous cycle of strategic indecision and desperation. With their armored counterattacks neutralized, they were compelled to fall back on heavily fortified defensive positions. But even static defense proved futile against the P-47's rocket armament. When facing entrenched positions, the P-47 pilots simply switched from armor-piercing HVARs to high-explosive warheads, utilizing the rocket's precision to suppress or obliterate bunkers, artillery positions, and troop concentrations that were too resistant for conventional artillery or infantry assault. The plane became the indispensable artillery piece of the infantry, available on demand, capable of delivering a punch far exceeding the heaviest field guns. This tactical flexibility meant the Germans could neither attack nor defend effectively. The generals, reporting directly to Hitler's headquarters, painted a bleak picture. The inability to amass forces, the constant degradation of supplies, and the utter demoralization caused by the Jabos, German term for these aerial attackers. The frustration was amplified by the inherent limitations of their own air force. While the Me-262 jet fighter offered technological superiority, it was too few in number and too focused on high-altitude defense to effect the ground war. The German command could only watch as the American industrial war machine poured out hundreds of P-47s, flown by pilots who were increasingly skilled in the specialized art of ground strafing and rocketry. The Jug became the symbol of Allied overwhelming material superiority, a constant physical reminder that the Axis had lost the battle for the air, and consequently, the battle for the ground. The plane's sheer durability contributed to inflated loss ratios for German flak units. For every P-47 lost to ground fire, the P-47s themselves were credited with destroying sometimes 50 or 60 armored vehicles. This disproportionate exchange rate hastened the end. Think about the strategic implications. The Germans needed to save their panzers for the inevitable defense of the fatherland, yet the P-47 forced them to expend their irreplaceable tanks in futile attempts to stem the Allied tide in France.
Every destroyed Panther was a resource the Germans could not reclaim. Every shipment of fuel or ammunition destroyed by a P-47's .50 caliber fire meant the surviving tanks were less operational. The cumulative effect of the P-47's HVAR attacks throughout the latter half of 1944 was the complete tactical strangulation of the German army in the West. When the Germans launched their final desperate gamble, the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, they counted heavily on poor winter weather to ground the Allied air forces, specifically the P-47s. For the first few days, the heavy fog and snow provided the Panzers with the essential cover they needed, and the offensive achieved terrifying initial success. The German generals, feeling a momentary reprieve, were almost euphoric. But as soon as the clouds broke, even briefly, the P-47s returned with a vengeance, equipped with rockets and bombs, turning the snowy roads of the Ardennes into the same fire-filled trap that had engulfed the Falaise Pocket. That return of the sun and the subsequent return of the P-47 was the true turning point of the Bulge, extinguishing the last flicker of German offensive capability in the West and confirming, once and for all, that no major German armored operation could succeed under skies dominated by the HVAR-equipped Thunderbolt.
The enduring legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt and its secret weapon, the HVAR, is measured not just in destroyed tanks, but in the total strategic paralysis it inflicted upon the Wehrmacht. It cemented the doctrine of air superiority as the prerequisite for ground success, a doctrine that remains foundational to modern warfare. The plane, originally conceived to fight at 30,000 feet, finished its career as the ultimate mud mover, flying inches above the earth, delivering tactical devastation that directly influenced the outcome of every major engagement on the Western Front from D-Day onward. The numbers speak for themselves, though definitive tallies are notoriously difficult in the chaos of war. P-47 pilots were credited with destroying thousands of tanks, armored cars, and locomotives, effectively dismantling the infrastructure that kept the German army fighting. By the spring of 1945, the sight of a P-47, sometimes painted with aggressive, snarling shark mouths or other intimidating nose art, was enough to cause immediate panic among German troops. The sound of its massive engine meant immediate dispersal, abandonment of vehicles, and desperate attempts to find cover, because experience had taught them that resistance was futile and remaining visible meant certain death. The P-47 proved that brute force, combined with high-technology ordnance, was the answer to heavy armor. It was the physical embodiment of the American industrial might, a relatively simple, robust platform carrying a complicated, highly effective weapon. The generals who literally wept over the operational reports were crying not just over lost material, but over the realization that the war they had perfected, the war of rapid, decisive armored movement, was now technologically obsolete. They had no answer for the power and presence of the P-47. In the history of air combat, many planes are remembered for their grace or speed. The P-47 Thunderbolt is remembered for its sheer, uncompromising violence and its indomitable will to survive. It was the tank killer, the truck destroyer, the locomotive wrecker, and the infantry's best friend. The aircraft's contribution went far beyond the front line. By enabling the rapid advance of Patton and the other Allied armies, it shortened the war, saving countless American infantry lives by neutralizing the most dangerous elements of the German defense.
The jug wasn't elegant, but it was effective. And in the crucible of total war, effectiveness is the only measure that truly counts. It defined a new type of close air support, one that relied on overwhelming firepower delivered with startling precision at incredibly low altitudes. The stories of P-47 pilots, like the legendary Colonel Francis Gabreski, transitioning from high-altitude fighter ace to ground attack master, symbolized this shift. They adapted, innovated, and conquered the ground war from the cockpit, ensuring that the Panzers would never again rule the battlefield under Allied skies. The German military legacy was reduced to burning wrecks along the roads of France, Belgium, and Germany, a testament to the devastating power of the Thunderbolt and its 5-inch Holy Moses rockets. The secret weapon wasn't just the rocket, it was the entire package: the durable plane, the fearless pilots, and the endless stream of deadly ordnance flowing from the American home front. Now, this whole story begs a question for you, the viewer watching at home. Which piece of ground attack ordnance do you think was the most effective game changer in World War II? Was it the P-47's HVAR, the British rocket, or perhaps something else entirely? Let me know in the comments below, because I love diving deep into your historical perspectives and theories about the weapons that truly turned the tide of the war. Don't be shy, your input drives what we research next on the channel. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the German generals, and the tears they shed over the destruction of their armor is one of the most compelling narratives of the air war. It's a story of how superior engineering and sheer willpower overcame the challenges of the most demanding combat environment. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the P-47's heavy beginnings to its final decisive role as the ultimate tank killer. If you found this dive into World War II history compelling, and you want more deep analysis, more true stories of heroism, technology, and absolute devastation delivered from the skies, then please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button. Join our community of history enthusiasts who understand that the real details are often more incredible than the legends. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden heroes and forgotten weapons of World War II. Until next time, keep studying history and keep supporting our channel. Thank you for watching.